I'm Renee Williams.
And I'm Billy Thomas.
And welcome to another edition of From the Woods Today. We have a wildlife theme going on today.
Yes, we always say trees are the answer, Renee, but wildlife's really important too, right?
So, exactly.
So glad to have you all with us today. Thank you so much for being with us. We have Dr. DJ McNeil. He's going to be talking about forest management and forest-dependent birds. So, again, trees are the answer for birds, apparently.
There you go.
Well, Dr. DJ McNeil will be sharing some really cool information about that. And then we have our very own Dr. Matt Springer as well. He's going to be talking about the basics of food plots. So we're glad to have this wildlife friendly show and glad to have you all with us. If you have any questions for our presenters, you can use the chat function if you're on Zoom with us. And if you're on YouTube, you can email us at forestry.extension@uky.edu and we'll get a response to you that way. But Renee, glad to be with you today. Glad to have all our viewers with us as well.
Definitely. We wouldn't have a show if it wasn't for them.
No.
Show, let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to talk about timber treatments for birds, and Dr. DJ McNeil will be on, and we're going to show a video that he did for us previously. So he couldn't be on today, unfortunately. So we're going to just go ahead and show that video. But if there are any questions, we do have Dr. Matt Springer, who will be able to hopefully answer those for any questions that we might have.
Okay, thanks for joining us today on another From the Woods Today Bird of the Month. So this month we're going to talk about a few common forest management treatments that get applied to eastern deciduous forests that you might use in eastern Kentucky or anywhere in Kentucky really that has extensively forested landscapes. And we'll talk about how different bird species use those different places, what kinds of birds you might find there. We can't cover really anything close to all of them, but just to give you a flavor of what kind of birds you might find in these different places and where they fit into the broad niche of different bird space use. So this again is just a brief overview of how different birds use different types of habitats in the context of eastern forest management. So probably the easiest place to start when thinking about eastern deciduous forest is mature forest. And when I talk about mature forest, I'm usually thinking of forest stands that haven't been harvested for at least 40 years. So they're dominated heavily by mature trees. These are closed canopy stands. They may have some amount of understory to them. The one I've got here doesn't have much in the way of understory. Probably suffering from deer browse. But these mature forest stands can still have a large number of different bird species in them. So you take a walk through mature forests in eastern Kentucky, and we're just going to cover a couple birds for each of these communities. But a couple of the birds that you're likely to encounter would be things like the wood thrush. So the wood thrush is a really cool bird. It spends a lot of its time on the ground, and if you take a look at the shape of this bird, you might think, gee, that kind of reminds me of a robin. Well, that's because the wood thrush and the robin are both in the thrush family, Turdidae. So they're both these kind of like plump, long-legged birds that run around on the ground. The wood thrush it's not much to look at. I think they're pretty in their own right, but it's brown and kind of streaky. It's got these spots on the breast and this kind of white eye ring and this sort of dingy cheek and this kind of chocolatey brown back, but otherwise it's not much to write home about in terms of looks. Now again, bird watchers may not be thrilled to hear that, but I think your average person isn't terribly impressed with the looks of the wood thrush. Where the wood thrush gets high marks is their really beautiful song. So some have said that it's the most beautiful song in eastern North American songbirds, and it's this rich flute-like eole, leo. So that's the wood thrush. And again, we can't even really scratch the surface with these birds today, but we're going to talk about just a couple of them for each community. Another bird that you're very likely to see in mature forest of Kentucky would be the eastern wood pewee. Now that's another one. It's kind of drab, and you'd be forgiven if you thought that it looks very similar to an eastern phoebe. In fact, I would say it does look similar to an eastern phoebe. Probably, if you're really into birds, one way you can tell it apart from the phoebe is the eastern phoebe, it has a fully dark bill, whereas the eastern wood pewee has this kind of yellowish or sometimes pinkish lower mandible. There's a few other things. The eastern phoebe tends to flick its tail more or less constantly, and the pewee doesn't do that. The eastern phoebe is much darker above than the wood pewee, which is kind of like a medium gray, where the phoebe is kind of that really dark gray, almost blackish in parts. But we're not talking about the phoebe here. The eastern wood pewee is a really cool bird, and this is one that sings. They'll sing almost all summer long. And it's a really easy bird to learn the song. So it's a flycatcher. It's got these long pointed wings, and unlike the wood thrush, which spends a lot of time on the ground, the wood pewee sits up on a perch like in this picture here, and they shoot out, catch an insect, and fly right back to the same perch. So that song is where it actually gets its name, wood pewee, because it says pewee in its song. So you'll hear these birds singing. They're singing right now in Kentucky, and they'll sing most of the summer before they head back to Latin America for the winter. So listen for their song. It's this kind of sad, mournful pee-wee, pee-woo. So, eastern wood pewee and wood thrush are two very common sort of mature forest birds that we might see. Now, if you're preparing your timber stand for regeneration and subsequent, or harvest and subsequent regeneration, you might do what's called a shelterwood harvest. And a shelterwood harvest is where you take out a small percentage of the trees to start letting light percolate into the understory and letting regeneration for things like oaks and hickories start to advance. So that way when you take the full canopy off of it later, you've already got advanced regeneration in the stand. Now, as you might expect, these types of stands have pretty distinct bird communities. Now, again, that's not to say you wouldn't see a wood thrush in a shelterwood harvest, but you certainly would have a distinct bird community there. One bird that's very common in many shelterwood harvests across Kentucky is the hooded warbler, and you can see where it gets its name. I've shown the male here. The female's a bit more drab. A nice yellow kind of underparts and a yellow face and this kind of greenish back, and of course the namesake black hood that the male has. This is another one. It's a really cute little warbler. I think they're very beautiful, and they have a fun little song. It's this kind of snappy, rolling weeda weeda weedio. And some variations on that. A bit faster. So listen for that weeda weeda weedio in these shelterwood harvests. And again, it's not impossible to find these birds in other habitats. In fact, you frequently will find hooded warblers in mature forests, but they seem to really, really love these shelterwood harvests. The next sort of shelterwood bird that I have for us is the appropriately named cerulean warbler. So these birds, they nest very high up in the canopy, unlike the hooded warbler, which tends to hang out very low to the ground. The cerulean warbler nests very high up in the canopy, and you're not likely to get a really nice look at them. But if you ever do get the chance, they're this nice blue on top. The female's a bit more of a greener, kind of almost a seafoam green. But the male's this like very nice, like cerulean blue. It has these kind of like bluish black streaks along the flanks, and it kind of, in a lot of birds, it'll form a necklace around sort of the throat area. Very nice bird. And the song is kind of this funny, it's like a beer, 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 bee. Here's a different bird. So the cerulean warbler is one to definitely watch for in these shelterwood harvests. In fact, the species is actually declining very rapidly due to the loss of habitat, and the shelterwood harvest is thought to be one of the main ways to restore habitat for the cerulean warbler. Okay, so very frequently after an overstory has been removed and a site is allowed to regenerate, you get this overstory removal or a clear-cut harvest. And of course, those habitats have their own very distinct birds in them. The first is the American woodcock. And of course, these I can't really emphasize this enough, these stands have a variety of bird species. You could walk through an overstory removal and easily see 30 or 40 bird species in a morning in Kentucky. But the American woodcock is a classic bird species that relies upon these early successional sort of open communities. And of course, many of us have seen the woodcock. It's a very beloved game bird, heavily hunted in the fall, September, October, when these birds are moving through. But of course, they breed here as well. It's a ground nesting bird. They lay 4 eggs, as is true with most shorebirds. And you might say, shorebird, what the heck? Well, the American woodcock is actually a shorebird that's adapted to live in forest, unlike most shorebirds. So they actually don't hang out near the water very often. They're mostly in these thickets, these young stands. Very distinctive bird. Of course, it's got a very heavily mottled back. It's got this kind of rufusy, like warm colored cinnamony flanks. And you've got this very strange shaped head. Of course, very long bill. And the eye, look where the eye is placed on the head. It's very far back. And that's because these birds, they probe with that long beak. You can see even in this picture, it's got dirt all over its beak. And that's because these birds forage for things like earthworms by probing their beak down in the soil. And while their bill is probed down in the soil, they've got that eye on the back of their head, basically, so they can still watch for predators while they're probing their beak down into the soil. Now, the American woodcock, you're not going to hear this bird unless you go out right at dawn or more commonly right at dusk. And they have a very interesting flight display. So their song, it's not much of a song. You might be mistaken for a frog. So here's the woodcock song, and it's just this kind of nasally eh. Now in Kentucky, the woodcock is mostly done doing this display, although on some nights you'll still hear it happening. Perhaps even more remarkable than that song that I just showed you there is actually the flight display. And the bird will do that painting a few times, and then they'll launch up into the air, fluttering all around. And as they do this, you'll hear this really incredible song that sounds like a songbird. But it's actually the wings of the woodcock making this very beautiful song. And the best time to hear this is think like April in Kentucky, March and April. So what I'm about to play for you is the flight display of the woodcock, and none of the sounds you're hearing are produced by the bird's voice. It's all by the wings. Really incredible birds. And of course, we could pick a ton of different species to talk about for other overstory removal birds, but one that easily the most common species in many of these is the eastern towhee. And we've talked about the towhee on From the Woods Today before, but it's such a fun bird. I think it's important to bring it up again. I've shown the male here. The female has the same color scheme, except anywhere the male has black, she has like a nice warm, like a milk chocolate brown. But the male has this black hood, black back, black upper parts on the tail with some white markings on the primary flight feathers, and this bright rufous flank. In fact, the species used to be called the rufous-sided towhee, but it's now called the eastern towhee. It was split apart from the spotted towhee, and of course the white belly. Really distinctive bird. It nests on the ground or very close to the ground, spends a lot of time near the ground. And the other thing that's fun about the towhee is it just has this really great song, and they deviate from it occasionally, but by and large they stick to a classic Drink your tea. So watch for eastern towhees while you're out walking through these early successional overstory removal stands. Now, as these stands get older, the saplings eventually grow and they grow and they grow, and the understory becomes shaded out, and the stand becomes dominated by woody stems. You lose that herbaceous component. So those things like towhees don't like to nest in that quite as much. Things like woodcock, same thing. But there are still many species of bird that do occur in these habitats. For instance, the ruffed grouse. So the ruffed grouse is another very popular game bird. It's think of it like a chicken that lives in the woods. It's a little bit smaller than your average chicken. A really cool bird though. They're mostly done displaying in Kentucky, but they've got this really interesting display. Hopefully I can play it for you and it'll come through on the speaker. If not, you can certainly Google it. But what the male does is he gets up on a log like you hear in the photo. He jumps up there and you can see he in this picture he's just about to display. So he fans out his tail to look really sexy for the female grouse, and he opens up his wings and he sort of puffs out his chest, and then he flaps his wings while he's standing on that log. Flaps his wings in front of him and he does flap, 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 flap. And what that does, it produces this drumming that sounds, and I'll play it for you here, something like this. We'll try one more. Now, one other bird species that's always fun to look for here in these stands is the rose-breasted grosbeak. Very distinctive. The male has this black hood, black back with white markings on the wing, not unlike a towhee. White belly again and white underparts, but you've got that rose spot on the breast that's very distinctive. And this is another beautiful song. It's this kind of like rich, sort of rambling warble that sounds almost like an American robin that's taken voice lessons. Okay, finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't at least talk about how some bird species are just kind of generalists. So when I say generalist, that's a fancy term for a bird that'll use a lot of different kinds of forest. So a classic forest generalist would be the red-eyed vireo. And some people argue that the red-eyed vireo kind of prefers mature forest, but I mean, it really is quite a generalist. I mean, they may achieve some of their highest densities in mature forest, but man, they're quite common in a wide variety of forest types. So it's a tough bird to get good eyes on because they spend a lot of their time up in the canopy, but they are pretty much ubiquitous. If you take a walk in Kentucky woods, it's hard to get away from the red-eyed vireo. And even when you do see them up close, it's not always clear to see that red eye. Sometimes it appears just dark. But we've got this kind of greenish olive back. You've got this gray cap and this little gray line through the eye, a white supercilium, this kind of eyebrow mark, and you've got a little bit of a dark eyebrow and this long kind of slightly hooked bill. It's like very long and there's a tiny little hooked tip. But you're more likely to hear the red-eyed vireo than you are to see them. And they, just like the wood pewee, they sing all summer long. So when you're walking around the woods, just listen for this rambling, never-ending song where they say, "Here I am. Where are you? I am here. Here I am. Where are you?" Just repeating it all day long. So the red-eyed vireo, they like to hang out up in the canopy and do their song all summer long. Well, probably the other forest generalist that actually hangs out closer to the ground, also kind of just singing through the dog days of summer, would be the ovenbird. So the ovenbird is an interesting little guy. It kind of looks like a thrush, and it acts like a thrush, but it's actually a small warbler. So it's smaller than most thrush, but it's bigger than your average warbler. Hangs out mostly on the ground, nests on the ground in the leaf litter, and it gets that funny name. I don't know who names these things, but it builds like a little a cave basically out of leaves. And someone saw that and thought, gee, that looks like an oven. Doesn't look like my oven, but apparently it looked like some oven somewhere. Um, but more to the point, the ovenbird is another kind of forest generalist you can hear almost any time of day out in Kentucky woods, at least during the breeding season. They hang out on the ground and they do their very loud song, which is this rolling teacher, 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 teacher. Okay, well, thanks for tuning in. I hope you learned a little bit about some eastern forest birds and how these different bird species respond to different aspects of forest management. And with that, we'll leave it at that, and looking forward to talking to you next month for next month's Bird of the Month.
Oh, we really appreciate having Dr. DJ
Sure.
McNeil on. That's a good segment. And, and I guess the answer is really trees, right? So trees are the answer, but the
It
birds really.
seems to depend on what kind of forest you have. And I never thought about that until now. It depends on, different birds seem to have different likes. And I guess, that makes sense. Just like humans have different likes,
Yep.
birds are the same way, and on where they want to live. So it's very interesting to hear all of that.
It is. I think, key takeaways: a diversity of habitats will attract a diversity of wildlife species,
Mhm.
right? Yeah. So a big thanks to Dr. DJ McNeil for preparing that. And keeping the kind of wildlife theme going, though,
Right.
we also have Dr. Matt Springer with us. Hey, Matt, how are you, sir?
I'm good. How are you all?
Good. Good.
Wonderful.
Didn't know
So
if you
tell
had
us a little. Oh,
I was.
go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. Renee. I was going to ask Dr. Springer if you had any comments or any follow up to DJ's presentation there. Any?
I see the comment that's in the chat box there, and so my guess would be it was probably a Oriole that was seen. They're very bright orange and have black and a little rounder head. And I had one in my yard yesterday, so they are definitely around, and that would be my guess. So if you want to take a look, Google probably Baltimore Oriole would be the most likely, and see if that matches what you saw.
Excellent.
Oh,
Thank you.
Wonderful.
and
So
then,
what are you going to be talking about
Yeah.
today?
Yeah, so I was getting ready to go. And then the reason I'm here is I am going to kind of cover a little bit of an introduction to food plots, right? So we just heard Dr. McNeil talk a lot about forest management and active management and the impacts it has on forest birds, and has similar impacts on a lot of our forest mammals and herps or reptiles, amphibians, depending on where you are. So we get, forest management is an active form of management. We also have other active forms of management within wildlife, and one of those is the addition of food plots. So I wanted to touch base a little bit about that, when and why and how and all that, and the 101. And sometimes it's a little surprising when you should or shouldn't do those things, because it's not an end all be all. So with that, can I transition right into it?
Yeah,
ahead.
thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Alright.
Yeah, I'm really glad to have Dr. Springer doing this, Renee, because this is something we hear from a lot of landowners all the time about
All the
interest in
time,
food
yes.
plots. Yeah, so
So-
thank you.
Yes, thanks.
Y'all see we're good?
Yes.
All
Yes.
right. So let's get into Food Plots 101, right? So this is a very brief kind of introduction to some of the ideas you need to be thinking about if you're thinking about trying to put in food plots on your property or property that you hunt or manage. The big thing here is the food plots is a component, as its name says, it's providing generally food for a specific species or many species of wildlife on your property. These can take many forms. The ones that we commonly think about within Kentucky, especially in the central and eastern part of the state, are for deer and turkey. So some kind of crop that we're growing in a field that is meant for those either mammals or birds. But in other areas, especially when you're getting a little closer to things like wetlands, or in the center part of a flyway, that can also be fields that are cultivated for waterfowl and waterfowl hunting or waterfowl viewing. But the big catch here is you're providing some kind of resource that these species need to survive, usually with priority being during a certain time of year, right? So most of these items are put in by hunters, and sometimes they're put in by wildlife viewers, and also resource managers trying to meet overall needs. I'm saying wildlife have needs, right? So what are some of those needs? And basically, you got to think about what is required for those species to survive. All of these needs are species specific, right? So we heard about which birds respond to which habitat type, and that's because that habitat is meeting their needs. And it could be in total or it could be partial, but general rule of thumb is we have food, cover, and water are the big ones that we always hear, and space is the other one. But that cover component can actually be broken down into many, many different subcategories, things like nesting habitat and cover, brooding habitat and cover, hibernating areas, daytime resting sites. So all of those kind of fit in. So as you're thinking about and we're approaching the idea of food plots, we want to make sure that food plots are not the first thing that you're looking at. We want to be thinking about what is being offered on your property and surrounding properties that are meeting the needs of the species you are managing for, or groups of species you are managing for. Because food plots are not a solution; they're a added component. So, and that kind of transitions right into are food plots right for your situation? And then some of the other questions I want to cover after you maybe say yes. Where should I put the food plot? What should I be thinking about as I pick a location for that? What should I plant in my food plot? And then finally, once you get something planted, how do you manage that so that you have the success that you need to accomplish your overall goal of providing that food resource to the wildlife species you're managing for? The questions associated with that food plot, is it food plot right for you, should involve a few different things. First and foremost, you need to understand what is your goal. Why are you planning this food plot? And from there, some of those questions need to be is food a limiting factor for the species I'm managing for in my area, on my property? A lot of times, and you're going to hear me focus a little bit more on deer because that's one of the most popular game species to plant a food plot for, is why are you trying to attract that wildlife species to that area? A lot of times that is for hunting purposes. It can also be for wildlife viewing purposes, photography. But the idea is you're trying to attract a species to a certain location for a reason. There are some comments and articles that are out there that talk about why you need food plots to grow larger deer or more deer in your area. That's a question. Is that one of your goals? Do you want to have bucks with larger antlers and you are trying to provide the best food that's out there? Well, some of that, these are all important questions and common questions that we face. The stories that are out there that are being perpetuated or sometimes can be a little misleading. And the science behind it is telling a pretty straightforward story. For Kentucky, for the most part, deer especially, but many of our wildlife species, food is not a limiting factor. That is not true in other areas of the country. Especially if you travel further south where soil quality is lower, right? So you get that red clayey soil. Nutrients that are available for uptake by plants are a lot less. So the plant quality is lower, the nutritional quality is lower. So in certain situations, food can be limiting. If you look at Kentucky, though, and one of the main reasons why we have horses in Kentucky is because our soil quality is such that we have a lot of nutrients that are available for uptake by plants, and that plant quality is there, nutritional quality is there, so food really isn't a limiting factor. The one exception may be if you're in eastern Kentucky along the mountains, and it's a bad mast year. And we have a lot of older forest habitat that doesn't have a lot of browse that's present on the within reach of deer, elk. In that case, then yes, food is a potentially limiting factor in those bad years, and it can hold back your populations. But if overall, if you think about a common property within the state of Kentucky that is got a healthy forest, potentially a lot of it is surrounded by ag land, that's all going to meet the overall nutritional quality needed for deer in the state of Kentucky. And in many places, we have so much food available. Parts of Western Kentucky, the triangle between Cincinnati, Lexington, and Louisville, we have an overabundance of deer that are very healthy. So there's a lot of food out there. Signs that you don't have enough food present for the number of animals you have, are things like browse lines, which is what you see in the back here, where animals are starting to eat themselves out of house and home and over consuming what they can and basically consuming anything they can to survive. Usually this happens when we have way too many deer in an area that the area can support, and a food plot won't really help you get over that hump, not in the state of Kentucky. More active management needs to occur. So the reality of food plots, given the fact that food really isn't a limiting factor in the state of Kentucky, is they will attract deer and other animals to a very specific location, which can allow you to do things like hunt or view wildlife. So that is definitely true. When you put a resource and concentrate in one area, animals will use it once they figure out it's there. The part about supporting larger herds of deer, a lot of that can be taken care of by just active, regular forest management, where you're meeting basically creating a healthy forest in combination with whatever crops may be around. In that case, you will have a sustainable population, 20 to 35 deer per square mile. So if you're hoping to see, 30, 40 deer in a sit while you hunt, then you're going to have to artificially hold those numbers higher, which is not impossible to do if you are in an area that's heavily agriculture, because they're the ones that are providing the food source for you, and your food plots are kind of supplementing that anyway. However, what is not scientifically backed is the idea that food plots by themselves can actually grow larger antlers. The easiest thing to do to allow a deer to have larger antlers is to let it get a year older. Antlers actually peak in the 5.5 to 7.5, 8.5 year old range for a buck. And the vast majority of our bucks do not get to that point in age. They're shot at 2.5, 3.5 years old. So simply letting a deer walk another year is going to have a larger impact on antler size than actually planting a whole bunch of food plots. And that kind of gets into this idea of proper herd management. So those are the basic things. There's other concerns outside of deer, with things like turkeys. You have to really be thinking about what is limiting for turkeys, and in a lot of cases it's poult habitat. So where they can take their poults to forage and find insects and be secure and safe from avian predators. So that's really not a food plot. They don't like to take those poults out in the open. So food plots won't really help accomplish that. You're looking at more things like native grasses or active forest management to meet those goals for turkeys. So it kind of depends on what you're looking at, what you're dealing with on your property, in terms of what goals or reasons you have for putting a food plot in. So let's say you decide that a food plot's right for what you're doing and meeting those goals. Most likely it's probably related to hunting or wildlife viewing / photography. What are the things you need to be thinking about in terms of establishing that food plot? Well, the first thing is, where are you going to put it? And they can vary in size, right? So as big as you want to make them, as small as you want to make them. A quarter of an acre, an eighth of an acre, a tenth of an acre, even smaller if you want. All the way up to dozens of acres, where we start thinking about, them being more of a crop field than a food plot for deer. But some of the big things you need to be thinking about is placement relative to where deer are going to find the plot and find it easily, And also, can you get in there and maintain that food plot for things like weeds, pest control, other treatments that you may need to do after you plant it? Because some of those are necessary and need to be thought about before you start trying to put some seed on the ground and start growing things. There are types of food plots that really don't require ease of access. It's just what kind of equipment are you going to need to put the food plot in that you're thinking about. Some great places to put these are in the corners or edges of existing ag fields where you're providing a different food source that may be available at a different time. Secluded areas of your property that maybe have the end of an access road that is very far away from a county road, a state road, a highway, something where it can't be seen by the general public passing by, somewhere you don't go through on a regular basis outside of when you may be looking to use that property. So all of those are good things. If you're thinking about deer hunting and deer food plots, the closer you can put them to a bedding area and cover, the better off you are. However, if you're going to use it for hunting or photography, and you want to be able to see the animals in the food plot, you need to make sure that you can access those plots without disturbing those bedding areas and scaring the deer away. There's a bunch, if you Google food plot strategies, there's a bunch of things that pop up that are out there, and every property is different. So you need to be, kind of take a look at what people are showing, how they approach things, try to learn a little bit from each one of them. And focus on the things like access roads, close proximity to deer bedding areas, other food sources, hunting stand placement, if that's your goal. All of those are the things you want to kind of focus on, see how each person approach them. And you need to be thinking about things like prevailing winds during hunting season or when you plan on using it is an important topic. The one that I like to folks to think about is because it incorporates a mixture of native habitat in with what you're growing, is that one in the center there that Missouri Extension uses. And that's where you're actually mixing, you're taking a field and then you're creating the bedding habitat within that field and that food plot, and you run strips of the actual food resource inside that actual native grass field. That's going to benefit a wider range of wildlife species, including the birds that we just heard Dr. McNeil talk about, rabbits, quail, along with your deer and turkey and so on. So it's a little bit more biodiverse of a food plot in terms of benefits. Next, so we've kind of thought about where we want to plant things, how we're going to access it. What are we going to plant, right? So, and this is where you kind of need to do a little sneaking on your neighbors in terms of Google Maps, and just kind of taking a look over the property line is, do you have ag fields next to you and what do they commonly grow? Because that's not what you want to plant, because that's already available to the wildlife that are on your property. So those are things you need to be, you don't want to duplicate what's already out there, because they're going to pick a 20-acre bean field over a 1-acre bean field every time. You also need to be thinking, there's crops that require more work in terms of spraying for weeds, more establishment time, more equipment, more involved in terms of planning and getting them established. So you want to make sure that you understand how that fits into your property, so that you can have an effective food plot when you move it in there. Generally, we want to actually plant a mix. If you are thinking about it, they're a really good choice. Because there's going to be multiple types of food being grown at once. Allow wildlife to pick what they want, so you get more benefit from that single acreage. And if one doesn't take, then you have others that are able to fill that void and create that biomass and nutrition that you're trying to get across. But overall, in general, we can clump these into one of two categories. We have cool season growing plants and warm season growing plants. The warm season ones are the common ones you're seeing being planted now and growing now. Your soybeans, cow beans, corn, sorghum, and such, sunflowers. Where the cool season ones are generally going to be planted in mid to late August, and then are going to start growing through the cooler months. So things like winter wheat, clover, spinach, and such, and greens. So those are the two basic groups, and you can mix the cool seasons together to make that mixture. And sometimes you can actually plant some of those cool seasons within your warm season crops in the fall to kind of have a burst of food there as well. So there's a lot of options out there. we commonly push this idea of, food plots being what we're growing. I already mentioned that native warm season grasses within that planting component. There's been a lot of work by Dr. Craig Harper that's looked at what do those bring to the table in terms of food. And browse and biomass that a native warm season grass planting brings in is almost as it's in the 2,000 pounds per acre area. And you also get a dual benefit of that cover component. So it's not like a native grass field is not also providing a lot of food for wildlife species. It's doing a little bit of both. So that's one of the things you want to be thinking about, because there are potential crop programs within the Farm Bill that may help you establish those over the long term, where getting food plots paid for within those programs are a lot harder. Next thing, you figured out where you're putting it, what you want to plant. Now you want to do a soil test. Use your local county extension office to help you. And then have them, a lot of them are helping either run the samples for free or just at cost, $5-7 a sample. And they have literature that's available on walking you through how to actually collect that sample. And then also will help you interpret those results. It's really important, right? This is farming. You don't want to try to be planting seeds into a field that doesn't have the nutrients and the ability to actually cause them to grow and be successful. So if you have to make amendments to that soil, they're going to help you identify what that is and how to do it. So once you got the test done, you need to start thinking about how you're going to prep the bed. May require killing existing vegetation, may require ripping up the soil to get it prepped. So all of this needs to be in place, and what you choose on planning kind of plays a role into what may be involved in the bed prep, including those amendments that you may need to work in. There's all kinds of equipment that you can use, from hand spreaders to ATVs and traditional tractors. All that's there, and it kind of depends on the resources that you have available to you, and also the size of the food plot and access to that food plot you are hoping to plant. Depending on what you're doing, if you go the native grass route, Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources actually has a native plant drill that's available to you. That you can reach out to their local office and find out how to get access to it and when you can get access to it, and they'll try to walk you through what goes into that. But a lot of time, I've put a bunch of food plots in just using an ATV or a hand spreader and some kind of tillage device. So it doesn't require a full-on thousands and thousands of dollars to get food plots in the ground. You can get some of them in the ground with just a rake and throwing seed by hand. So it just depends, but you want to follow the instructions that are there based on the plants that you choose to put in the ground for your food plot. Follow those instructions, the seeding amounts and so on, and that'll help get you to where you need to have a successful planting. Once you get all of that going, one of the things I want to make sure to push on here is following those instructions. And name brand seed doesn't necessarily mean better results or attracting more wildlife. That can come into play in commercial agriculture, where you could have a large benefit depending on your situation of bushels per acre produced. But if you're thinking about this, we're just trying to get some biomass out there for wildlife. Bushels of seed, 2 bushels is probably not going to be make or break it for the success of your food plot. So pick what's right for you. Some of the non-name brand stuff is a lot cheaper than the name brand, so it may allow you to get more acres planted. And you also want to be paying attention to the live seed amounts, as well as the seeds per acre, the poundage per acre that you need to plant. And if you have any questions on that, your ag agents in your local counties can help you interpret those things. Once your plot is planted and you're hoping for rain to get it going, you want to be thinking about maintenance. So checking in to see how that's establishing, identifying any weeds that may be popping up and need spraying, right? You don't want Johnson grass taking over your new plot. So you may need to be fairly active in weed management, especially if it's a newly established plot first couple of years where there's a lot of seed in that seed bed. You want to make sure you can ID those weeds appropriately, because a lot of the things that we commonly refer to as weeds are actually really good wildlife food resources. If you have some ragweed pop up in your food plot and you like quail and doves, having that ragweed there is actually not a bad thing because they produce a lot of seeds that are available to those birds that are highly preferred. So learning to ID weeds is going to become the name of the game. And then there's a lot of resources out there on how to treat the ones that you do want to get rid of. Other pests may pop up that you may not want around. Things like groundhogs, raccoons, beavers have been known to get into turnip patches and so on and so forth. So you need to be prepared to deal with them as appropriate. And then, you got to figure out a way to determine success. So have you met your management goals when you put that food plot in? And one of the best ways to do that is come up with some kind of monitoring strategy. Generally, there's two that are commonly used. The first is looking at how much biomass is created, and you can simply do that by putting a fence or two within your food plot, keep herbivores out, right? Keep those deer from eating it. So you can truly look at how much growth you have for what you plant. And, if you have a good food plot that's highly desirable, it may be hard to determine that if the deer come in and consistently are consuming that growth. Which isn't a bad thing. It's a good thing, right? So it's meeting the goal of attracting wildlife and having them pursue it. But it's hard to tell the difference between no growth because deer are consuming it and no growth because my soil and growing is not going well. That's where that fence comes in and allows you to determine what your area would look like without being consumed. The other thing is just simply using trail cameras and monitoring use over time. So this is usually happening anyway for hunting purposes. But it helps you determine where and when those wildlife are using those plots and then inform future management decisions. And with that, at the end of the year, when you're getting ready to plant again, if it's an annual food plot, take all that all that monitoring information in, all the success or amount of time and effort went into putting that in and start thinking about moving forward in the future and whether or not it was worthwhile. Keep in mind, though, if it's a new food plot in a new area, it may take 2 to 3 years for the wildlife really to find that resource. So don't make knee-jerk reactions on limited data. In addition, if it's a really strong mast year in your location, they're going to choose those acorns over anything you plant any day. So that's another thing to be thinking about as you move forward with your plans in the future. And with that, I'll happily take any questions, and I will put a giant plug in for Dr. Craig Harper's Guide to Wildlife Food Plots and Early Successional Plants. This is an amazing resource that he put a bunch of time and effort into and science. And I got it on my shelf here, and I use it all the time because it really does have it's got everything there for you. And it's readily available in a lot of different places. And as textbooks go, it's relatively cheap. So if you're thinking about getting into food plots, especially long term, or even if you just want an easy to use weed ID book, this is a great resource for that. So with that, I will happily, take the questions.
You get a two for thank you, Dr. Springer.
See that? I was very confused. I thought all of a sudden Renee had a new video trick where she could pop her head into those.
No, we were having a little issue with our camera. But anyway, do appreciate that segment there because there is a lot to think about it, and Renee and I were sitting here talking about selecting the right plants, and really it's kind of based on the species you're trying to attract, right?
Yeah, it is. So deer will eat 749 different types of plants that we know of. So you get a lot of leeway there for them, but it gets a lot harder when you start talking about waterfowl or turkeys. You need to know what really is going to attract them, so your options become a little bit more limited. But there's a lot of resources out there to help navigate that and make good, solid choices.
Another quick question, sometimes people think about maybe just like pouring corn on the ground. That's really different than a food plot. We're really just kind of baiting sort of at that point, right?
Yeah, so that would fall into the idea of either baiting or feeding. It's a commonly used practice in the state of Kentucky in the South. It kind of achieves a different goal. It's not one within, if you start thinking about wildlife disease, it's not as great because that's a very small attraction point where you get a lot of concentration of individuals, which raises that risk of contact rates and disease transmission. So it's a little bit different than a food plot that can be acres and acres in size. So, you know, there's, yeah, it's different. Generally, a lot of folks use that feeding, baiting mentality more for the hunting side. Unless you throw it in a bird feeder, then it's completely different. So.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Well, thank you so much for your presentation. We greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, always happy to be here.
Yeah, it's excellent. Thank you, Dr. Springer. So Renee, man, covered a lot of wildlife
We
stuff
did.
today. Man, we got to kind of sit together.
And I'm disappearing a lot.
No, yeah, it was good though.
Yeah.
I do appreciate Dr. DJ McNeil for his presentation. You know, and again, trees are the answer,
Right.
You know,
No matter what the question.
Yeah. Although Dr. Springer did kind of poke a little hole in that, you know,
Yeah.
because we can grow some other stuff for
Right.
wildlife. But again, appreciate both of our guests today and the content they covered.
Yeah, definitely. And, you know, we greatly appreciate you. You know, that was the one thing that makes this show what it is having our viewership. So we greatly
Yep.
appreciate people tell people, you
Yeah.
know, share the link, let people know that we have this going on and we're here for them.
And no doubt we could save your friends and family members time and money if they have the right information at the right time and they know who to contact. And From the Woods Today is a great way to make those connections for folks across the state who are trying to really be good stewards of the land they own.
They are. So we greatly appreciate it. And we will see you next week at 11. Take care.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone.
From the woods today.